They said the bell only rang at dawn, yet villagers swore they heard it at midnight. The tower was locked, the ropes untouched, the hammers unmoved. Still its toll echoed across the valley, summoning those who listened. No one who entered the belfry after the midnight ringing was ever seen again. The camera lingers on a wide valley, bathed in low morning fog. Trees rise like pillars through the mist. A river cuts across the land, reflecting a pale and muted sky. At its center stands the outline of a church, modest, unfinished, its walls still fresh with lime wash, its stones uneven in color. And above it, rising higher than the nave, higher than the roof of the cloister, a skeletal frame of timber signals a place where the bell tower would soon stand. The year was 1624. Spain held the land. The friars of St. Augustine's order had crossed the sea decades earlier, carrying scripture, relics, and iron castings brought from the heart of Seville. They claimed this valley in the name of God, and they promised its people that faith would conquer famine, plague, and death. The tower was meant to be the symbol of that promise. They called it La Torre del Silencio, the Tower of Silence. It was not built in haste. The masons brought from Castile laid the foundation in deep trenches, hammering stones until they rang against one another. Timber was felled from nearby forests and stripped by hand. Brick by brick, day by day, the bell tower climbed into the sky. Villagers worked for no pay, their service counted as tithe, their hours seen as sacrifice. Every strike of hammer on stone echoed across the valley like a heartbeat. But from the first days, something seemed strange. The records of Brother Mateo, one of the friars, described the work with unease. He wrote of men falling ill as they laid the cornerstone, not from sickness known to the time, no fever, no plague, no wasting. Instead, he claimed they grew restless at night, unable to sleep, whispering of sounds beneath the ground. They said the earth beneath the tower hummed, not loudly, not enough for all to hear, but faintly, like a vibration under the soil, a resonance that rose when they pressed their ears to the stone foundation. The friars dismissed it. They called it wind, or foolishness. Still, the masons hesitated. Brother Mateo recorded in the margin of his journal, "The men believe the ground resists them. They say the earth itself does not wish to be broken here. I told them stone is dumb, but in the silence of night, I too think I hear it." The structure climbed higher, 3 levels of stone, each cut from the quarry east of the valley. The walls narrowed as they rose, tapering like a pyramid. Arches were fitted into the sides for windows that would one day hold louvres, letting the sound escape across the valley. It was said you could see the tower from miles away. Even half-built, it cast its shadow longer than the church itself. The people grew proud, but there were others who muttered. Farmers in the outer hills said the tower stood on cursed land, that before the friars came, before the church laid claim, there had been a burial ground there, not Christian, older. They warned that digging so deep would stir the bones of forgotten. The friars dismissed them too, and the work continued. By 1626, the tower was nearly finished. At its crown, scaffolding groaned in the wind. The last stage was clear, the hanging of the bell. This was no ordinary casting. It had been forged in Spain, carried across the sea in the hold of a ship, and hauled by cart across valleys and mountains to reach the friary. Its bronze was said to contain more than metal. Powdered bone was whispered to have been mixed in with the alloy, not human bone, but that of oxen sacrificed for strength. It was meant to ring pure, to drive away storms, and call the faithful from leagues away. The bell was massive, for men could stand inside it. Its rim was thick, its mouth wide. Across its surface were Latin inscriptions, prayers of Augustine, entreaties to Mary. At its crown, carved into the metal itself, was a single phrase, non vox hominis, sed Dei, not the voice of man, but of God. The villagers gathered for its raising. They crowded the square, carrying candles, their eyes lifted upward as ropes strained against pulleys. The friars prayed aloud, their chants mixing with the creak of timber. Slowly, the bell rose from the cart, swaying in the air. Children covered their ears, though the bell had not yet rung. They said it made a sound, even in silence, a low note too deep for words. But the friars insisted it was the wind again. The bell was fixed in place before sunset. Its clapper hung heavy, bound with rope, so it would not sound until consecration. And on the next morning, the ceremony began. The whole valley assembled. Incense rose in clouds. Choirs sang hymns. At the appointed hour, the friar-prior blessed the bell, sprinkling it with holy water. He raised his hands and declared the first toll should resound not as man's work, but as heaven's promise. The crowd fell silent. The rope was untied. The bell swung forward. Its mouth opened toward the valley, and the first strike landed. The sound should have been clear. It should have rung bronze and high, echoing against the hills. But the records agree. The sound was not what they expected. It was lower, thicker, like the sound of the earth groaning. The villagers flinched. Mothers clutched their children. Even the friars fell silent. The sound did not fade as bells usually do. It lingered. It carried on the wind in a way no one could explain. They said it seemed to circle the valley, rebound from the hills, and return again. And then something stranger happened. The people closest to the tower swore they felt the vibration in their chests, not just in their ears, in their bones. One witness wrote, "The bell rang inside me, as if it were not around us, but within us." Another wrote simply, "It was not the voice of God." The friars continued the ceremony, masking their unease with chants, but their voices faltered. The sound of the bell still hung in the air, even though the clapper had stopped. For long moments, the valley remained silent, and then the second toll began, but no hand had touched the rope. The bell swung of its own accord. The clapper struck. The sound rolled again, thicker, heavier, pressing down like a weight. Children screamed. Villagers turned and fled. The friars shouted for order, their voices drowned. The bell rang a third time, and that was when they heard it. Voices. Not one, not two, but many, carried an echo. Not words, not language, just sound. A chorus buried within the toll, weaving between the vibrations. Some thought it was chanting. Others thought it was weeping. But all agreed it was not human. The priors ordered the tower sealed. They declared the bell would not be rung again until they understood its meaning. Ropes were cut, the belfry locked. Guards were set to keep the curious away. But even then, at night, villagers claimed to hear it, a faint tolling. Just once, at midnight, they swore the sound carried across the valley even when the bell was bound, even when the tower doors were barred. Brother Mateo's final note from that year reads, "The tower is built, the bell is hung, but its voice is not ours. We are afraid of what we have raised." The friars called the bell a gift, but the villagers had another name. They whispered the cursed toll. They began to say the bell did not call the living to prayer. It called something else. And in the stillness of the valley, when the fog rolled thick, some swore they saw shapes moving toward the tower. Figures in silence, drawn by a sound no ear should hear. The tower stood tall, gleaming in the sun by day, but by night it loomed black against the sky, and its shadow fell longer than ever before. The valley is dark. A pale moon drifts behind thin clouds. The fields lie empty. The cottages shuttered, their chimneys long cold. Only the tower of St. Augustine rises against the night, its stone walls silver in the dim light, its black windows hollow and staring. The bell above, though silent, seems almost alive in its stillness. The year was 1627. It had been nearly a full season since the consecration. The bell had been silenced after its first unnatural peals, bound by ropes and chains, forbidden by order of the friars themselves. For months, the belfry remained locked, its doors barred, its stairwell left of dust. But silence, it seems, did not mean peace. The villagers began to speak in whispers. Farmers claimed to wake at midnight to the sound of faint ringing. Shepherds swore the sheep stirred in their pens, their heads lifting, their bodies trembling, though no hand had touched the bell. Mothers pressed pillows to their children's ears when the hour struck, as if to keep something unseen from seeping in. The friars called it superstition, yet their journals tell another story. Brother Mateo wrote of waking one night to the vibration of glass in the cloister windows. He swore it came with no wind. Others in the dormitory stirred, their faces pale in candlelight, admitting they too had heard it. And then the first incident was recorded. It was a night of March 12th. The sky was clear, the air still. Midnight came like a hell breath, and the bell began to toll. No rope pulled, no hand touched. It rang once. The sound rolled low across the valley. It rang twice. The vibration carried through the stones of the church itself, rattling the beams, quivering in the glass of lanterns. It rang a third time, and that was when the monks stirred. Four of them, awakened in their cots, rose without speaking. Eyewitness accounts say their movements were slow, deliberate. They did not dress. They did not light candles. They simply walked barefoot through the cloister hall toward the base of the tower. Other friars called after them. Their voices were ignored. One described it as if the four were deaf to everything but the sound. Another wrote, "They did not see us. Their eyes were open, but they did not see us. The tower door should have been locked, its chains sealed with iron. Yet when the four reached it, the bar fell loose with no sound. The door creaked open, and they entered. The bell tolled again. Those who followed described the stairwell as heavy with dust and used since the consecration. But the four walked steadily, as if they knew the path. Their bare feet left prints in the grime, and they climbed. The other friars stopped at the threshold. Some claimed they could not move forward, not from fear, but from something heavier, a pressure in the chest, a weight in the bones. Only one man continued, Brother Hernan. He lit a lantern, clutching it with trembling hands, and followed the four up the spiraling stairs. His journal remains the only surviving account. He wrote that the air grew colder with each step. The higher he climbed, the more the sound seemed to come not from above, but from within the walls themselves. He described hearing whispers, faint and indistinct, rising between each toll of the bell. They were not words, he wrote, but something like words, a crowd speaking in unison, in a tongue no man could shape. When he reached the final steps, the four monks were already at the belfry. The lantern light caught them. Their faces were blank, eyes fixed on the bell. Their lips moved, though no sound escaped. And then the bell swung. The clapper struck. The sound exploded in the chamber. Hernan dropped the lantern, its glass shattering across the stones. The flame guttered but did not die. In its flicker, he swore he saw the four monks place their hands upon the bell, not on the ropes, not on the supports, on the bronze itself. They pressed their palms to its surface, as though in reverence, as though listening. And then they were gone, not vanished in smoke, not in fire. They were simply no longer there. Hernan wrote of blinking, of his eyes watering from the sound. And when he looked again, the bell stood alone, swinging gently. The monks had disappeared. He fled the tower. He fell down the stairs. His knees bloodied, his breath ragged. He ran into the cloister, shouting of what he had seen. The others found the bell still swaying, its tolling fading into silence. The four monks were never seen again. Their cots remained empty. Their robes, their sandals, their books, all left behind. The friars searched the tower from base to crown, touching every stone, every beam. They found nothing, and still the bell hung, silent once more. The villagers whispered of it for months. They said the monks had not vanished. They had been taken, drawn into the sound itself. Some claimed to hear their voices when the bell rang again, buried deep within its echoes, calling for release. The church denied it. The records omitted the names of the four. They were not declared dead. They were erased. But one line survives, scratched in haste into Hernan's journal, its ink smeared by a trembling hand. The bell is not rung by us. It is rung by them. The following nights were restless. Every toll became suspect. Every midnight an hour of fear. Villagers stopped venturing out after dark. Children covered their ears long before the hour struck. And in the cloister, candles burned through the night, for no friar dared to close his eyes when the bell might speak again. But silence did not last, because on the following week, the bell tolled again, and this time more than monks heard the voices. The morning sun fell weakly over the stones of St. Augustine's. The tower cast its shadow far across the courtyard, longer than the nave, longer than the cloister walls, reaching into the fields beyond. Its windows were black hollows, and at its crown the bell hung still, bound by ropes that frayed with damp. For a time, the friars avoided it. They prayed in low voices, their hymns sung without conviction, their sermons drifting into silence as the memory of the vanished for pressed upon them. But faith demands rituals, and rituals demand hands to keep them alive. So a keeper was appointed. His name was Diego. He was not a friar, nor a monk. He was a villager, one of the few willing to approach the tower after nightfall, broad-shouldered from years of labor. Quiet by nature, Diego had worked as a porter for the friary, carrying timber, water, and stone. When no one else volunteered, the friars placed a responsibility upon him: to guard the ropes, to keep the belfry sealed, and to toll the bell only at commanded hours. It was an honor, they told him, but it was not. The rope coiled at the base of the tower, like a living thing, thick, woven from hemp, its fibers rough with age. It hung straight from the belfry, bound tightly, knotted so that it would not swing without the keeper's pull. By day, Diego kept watch, sitting on a bench by the tower door. He told those who passed that the rope never moved. At night, however, that was when the rumors began. Villagers whispered that they saw him walking the tower stairs after midnight, lantern in hand, his face pale, his steps unsteady. Some swore they heard the creak of the rope, the groan of the beam, though the bell itself did not always ring. Diego denied it. He told the friars he never left his bench, that he kept the rope knotted, that he never touched it. But something wasn't right, because people swore they saw him. On the night of June 4th, 3 villagers returning late from the fields claimed they heard the bell. Faint, one strike, then silence. They rushed toward the square, and there in the moonlight, they swore they saw Diego's silhouette in the belfry window. His hand rested on the bell itself, his head bowed as if in prayer. Yet, when they reached the courtyard, the tower door was locked. Diego sat at its base, half asleep, the lantern by his side. They shook him awake. He swore he had not moved, and that was when he heard it. The rope at his side shifted. Slowly, a creak against the beam above. The villagers froze. The lantern flame guttered. The rope moved again, uncoiling by inches, though no hand touched it. And then the sound came. The bell tolled. Low, heavy, like the earth itself sighing. The courtyard filled with echoes. Windows in the village rattled. Chickens cried in their coops. The villagers screamed, pointing at the tower, swearing they saw Diego's figure in the window once more. But Diego sat beneath them, shaking, his hands clutching the bench until his knuckles bled. The friars investigated. They questioned him. He repeated the same words again and again. I never touched the rope. But the accusations grew. More villagers swore they saw him climb the stairs at night. A novice friar testified he heard Diego speaking softly to himself, words he could not understand, standing by the rope in the dark. The friars grew restless. Fear spreads quickly when it has a face to rest upon. And so they demanded a confession in the refectory under candlelight. Diego was brought before them. His hands trembled. Sweat beaded on his brow. He insisted he was innocent, that he never entered the belfry, that he never pulled a rope, but his voice faltered, because each time he swore he had not touched the bell, the candles in the hall flickered as if stirred by a breath. Witnesses said he seemed confused, as though doubting his own words. He pressed his palms to his ears, shaking his head, whispering that he could hear something, a sound beneath the friars' voices, a note no one else could hear. And then he stopped, his body stiffened, his eyes fixed on the shadows of the hall. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but only a rasp came out. The friars leaned in, waiting for his confession, but Diego never gave one. That night before dawn, his body was found. He lay at the base of the tower, limbs bent unnaturally, his skull fractured on the stones. His lantern lay shattered beside him, its oil staining the ground. The rope hung still above, its knot secure, its fibers unmoved. The friars declared it suicide. The villagers did not believe it. They said he had been pulled, drawn upward, only to be cast down. Some whispered they saw him fall, that he dropped not from the belfry window, but from the very mouth of the bell itself. The friars barred the tower once again. They sealed the rope in chains, bolting the door shut. But fear cannot be sealed so easily, because the bell did not fall silent. It rang again, and each time it did, the villagers swore they heard Diego's voice, calling, crying, confessing, but no one could make out the words, and no one dared climb the stairs to listen more closely. The valley was quiet, too quiet. Mist clung to the river like a shroud, and the cottages that once dotted the hillside now appeared abandoned, their doors hanging open, windows dark. Smoke did not rise from chimneys. Lanterns swung on empty porches, moving only with the breath of the wind. It was 1628. St. Augustine's bell tower had grown taller than memory, casting its shadow across the village. Its toll was no longer a simple sound. It was a signal, a warning. Villagers began to leave. Records of the time, now preserved in the friary archives, show entire families abandoning their homes after the bell rang 3 times in a single night. Doors left unlocked, food left to spoil, livestock unattended in pens. Some claimed the sound of the bell pulled at them, tugging at their limbs, commanding them to leave before dawn. And many did. One farmer, Alonso, left his home with nothing but the clothes on his back. He told neighbors he could not explain why, only that the bell called and he obeyed. His wife and children followed, silent, without argument. Their neighbors watched as the family walked into the mist, disappearing along the narrow path toward the mountains. By morning, the village was emptier than ever, but no one spoke of it, and that was when the fear grew. People began whispering in corners, glancing toward the tower as if it might watch them in return. Children cried quietly in their beds. Women pressed their palms to the walls of their homes, as though they might block some unseen sound from entering. Men worked in fields, eyes darting toward the belfry, ears straining for the faintest toll. But the friars silenced them. The church claimed the accounts were exaggerated. Letters sent to higher authorities insisted the villagers were merely superstitious, that fear had clouded their judgment. Any testimony that survived was stripped of names, replaced with phrases like, "The faithful withdrew for private reflection." Yet the journals tell the truth. Father Tomas wrote the night he witnessed 3 families leave at once. The bell tolled, yet no rope had been pulled. He described the children walking in trance-like states, their hands empty, their faces blank. Mothers followed, weeping quietly. Fathers walked behind, muttering prayers, but never raising a hand to restrain them. And the bell tolled again, 3 strikes, and that was when he heard it, a voice, faint, carried in the echo of the bronze. Not a voice of a man, not a voice of a child, something else, something that seemed to come from inside the bell itself. People fell silent. Even the priests could not speak. Some villagers left that night and never returned. Others stayed, huddled in their homes, windows shuttered, lanterns lit through the long hours of darkness. They swore the bell haunted their dreams, ringing in sleep as it did in wakefulness. It became impossible to distinguish reality from fear. Neighbors whispered of seeing the missing return briefly, only to vanish again. Shadows in the corners of rooms, footsteps in empty hallways, flickers of movement in the fog. And yet, the church maintained its control. Those who spoke too openly were accused of blasphemy. Letters to officials described them as overly imaginative, disturbed, or rebellious. Some were removed quietly from the village, sent to distant parishes, never to speak of the bell again. But silence cannot erase memory. Families who remained moved inwards, shutting doors, locking windows, avoiding the square. Children were not allowed outside at night. Livestock was tethered tightly, lest the animals respond to bell's sound in ways humans could not understand. Even daylight offered little comfort. The shadows of the tower stretched across the fields. The cobblestones of the square seemed darker, heavier, as if the bell's presence lingered in the stones themselves. Birds avoided the belfry. Dogs whimpered when near it. Even the wind carried a weight, a low hum that unsettled those sensitive enough to hear it. And that was when the reports began. People claimed they could hear whispers carried on the wind, voices speaking in rhythms that mirrored the bell's toll. Not words, but patterns. Some believed it to be the voices of those who had vanished, trapped somehow within the bell's sound. Others thought it was a warning, a call to obedience. And always it began with 3 tolls. Father Tomas noted in his journal that the bells seemed to anticipate the villagers' actions. Families left before the strike ended, as if compelled by an invisible hand. Some he followed, hoping to stop them, but he could never reach them. They were gone by the time he reached the edge of the misty fields. The village became a place of quiet terror. Doors were left ajar, lanterns lit without reason, and whispers filled the empty spaces. No one dared speak openly of what they saw. Fear had become a language of its own. And yet, there were those who remained. Old women, stubborn farmers, children too young to understand the danger fully. They moved through the empty streets with caution, avoiding the square where the bell tower rose like a sentinel. Every movement was deliberate, every sound noted, every shadow considered. The bell continued to toll, though no one touched the rope, and the villagers learned to obey. Obey the silence, obey the tower, obey the unseen pull that commanded their lives. Even as families left, even as the church silenced their stories, the memory persisted. The sound of the bell lingered in rooms long after nightfall. It echoed through the valley like a pulse, reminding those who remained of what had been lost. No one spoke, no one returned, and that was when the terror became complete. For the villagers who stayed, who hid in their homes, who obeyed without question, the bell was no longer a bell. It was the master of the village. Its voice carried across empty streets, into shuttered windows, in the hearts of those too afraid to leave. Its toll was a rhythm none could resist. Its call was a law, and the village would not speak of it, because speaking might awaken it further. Mothers rocked children to sleep in silence. Fathers whispered prayers only to themselves. Doors were barred, gates locked, but the sound persisted. 3 strikes, and that was when they heard it. Not just the bell, not just the echo. The faint chorus of voices, rising in the stillness, weaving between the tolls. Words never understood, pleas never answered. And in that chorus, a warning. Stay, leave, listen, obey. The village learned to hide, to vanish in plain sight, to obey the silence above all. And in the shadows of the belfry, the bell waited. The library was silent. Dust floated in shafts of afternoon sunlight, settling on the edges of thick volumes that smelled of mildew and old ink. Shelves rose like walls, carved from dark oak, enclosing the archivist in a labyrinth of history. Outside, the belfry of St. Augustine's rose above the village, its shadow slicing the square into long, cold rectangles. It was 1727. Father Ignacio, appointed archivist of the friary, moved carefully between the stacks. His hands brushed the spines of manuscripts, rubbing centuries of neglect from the leather. He was meticulous, deliberate, obsessed with order. Yet in the margins of the older journals, he found irregularities, letters, hidden in envelopes stitched into bindings, notes slipped between pages, account of events the official records did not mention, and all spoke of the same thing, the bell, its tolls, and the choir within. Ignacio read by candlelight. The letters described an unseen choir, voices that rose between each strike of the bell, not the voices of men or children, not the voices of the living. Something else, speaking in rhythm, weaving between sound and silence. They called it the voice of those lost. One note said, another, it sings when the bell calls, when hands do not pull the rope. Ignacio felt a shiver crawl along his spine. He turned to the journals of Hernan and Tomas, tracing the events that had led villagers to vanish. He compared the dates, the times of night, the number of tolls. Patterns emerged, and he listened. For weeks, he worked in the library long after the friars had gone to bed. The wind moved through broken windows, stirring the pages of open books. Lanterns swung in the corners of the room, throwing shadows that twisted across the walls. He thought he heard the bell, at first faint, a low vibration beneath the floorboards, a resonance that rose and fell like a pulse. But something wasn't right, because it was not the wind. It was not the distant tower. He could hear voices, soft, layered, rising between the tones, repeating in rhythm. And that's when he heard it. A pattern. Not words. Not language. But a sequence. A cadence. A rhythm embedded in the ringing. A signal that repeated across decades. Unchanged. Imperceptible to anyone who had not studied it or listened too closely. Ignacio became consumed. He recorded everything. He made charts of tolls, symbols to represent the voices, notes on pitch and duration. He copied letters, stacked them neatly, created tables that should have been meaningless, but to him they formed a map to something no one else had understood. He spoke to no one. Friars came to check on him, found him pale, hunched over candlelight, eyes wide, whispering to himself. The rhythm is clear, he muttered. They are telling us something. Neighbors passing the friary claimed they could hear him talking the night, though the windows were shut. Some said he spoke in Latin. Some said he spoke in a voice that did not belong to him, rising above his own words. But no one could enter the library after dark. Ignacio refused, and then the letters began to disappear. Bound journals, notes, correspondence, gone from the shelves overnight. The friars claimed they were misplaced. Some suggested Ignacio imagined them, but he knew better. He had deciphered the rhythm, and that night he left a note in his journal. I have heard them. I know the measure. I understand. The bell will call, and I must follow. He was found the next morning at the base of the bell tower. The lantern at his feet, glass shattered, candles extinguished, his journal open, pages blank. No sign of struggle, no rope disturbed. The tower doors locked from the inside. The friars insisted he had wandered too far, that he had fallen in sleepwalking, but the village whispered. They said he had answered the bell, that he had joined the unseen choir, that the rhythm had claimed him, pulled him into a sound no mortal should survive. Even those who refused to speak could not hide their fear. They avoided the library. They avoided the tower. They avoided the tolling, faint or imagined, that haunted their days and nights. The archives, once a place of knowledge, became a tomb of secrets. Letters disappeared. Records were rewritten. Witnesses were silenced. And the bell waited for the next voice to follow the rhythm, for the next listener to hear. And in the quiet of the friary, shadows stretched longer. Candles flickered. Pages turned on their own in abandoned books. The wind carried a low murmur, almost imperceptible, rising and falling in a cadence that echoed the bell's call. And somewhere in the rhythm of bronze and air, Ignacio's voice joined them, unseen, unheard by most, but part of the sound, waiting to call the next. The night was thick with mist. Lanterns flickered weakly along the cobbled streets of the village, casting long, trembling shadows across empty doorways. The belfry of St. Augustine's rose above them all, dark against the pale moon, its silhouette sharp as a blade. It was the hour between midnight and the first hint of dawn. Witnesses would later describe what they saw that night. They spoke in hushed tones, careful to avoid the attention of the friars. They claimed to see villagers moving through the streets, their eyes vacant, hands dangling by their sides. Mothers, fathers, children, entire families walking in silence toward the tower. But they spoke no words. No one touched them. No one commanded them. Yet they moved as if drawn by a magnet, pulled inexorably toward the belfry. And that was when he heard it. The bell tolled. 3 strikes. Low, resonant, carrying far across the field and cottages, through the shuttered windows, past the frightened animals in their pens. And the villagers continued. One observer, an innkeeper named Salvatore, later recounted standing at his door, lantern in hand, watching neighbors pass without pause. Their feet moved in rhythm with the echoes. Their heads bowed slightly. Occasionally, a hand would rise, brushing the air, as if tracing invisible lines in the night. But something wasn't right. He called out. No response. The procession reached the square at the base of the tower. The stone steps seemed taller than memory. The gates remained locked. Iron bars stretched across the entryway, the chain secured by the friars weeks before. And yet the villagers passed through. Witnesses swore the bodies did not climb, did not crawl. They were simply gone. Salvatore described the shock, the disbelief. His knees buckled. Lantern clattered to the stones. He rushed forward, but there was no one to see, no one to stop, no one left behind. Only the echo of footsteps that had vanished into silence. The friars arrived the next morning. They found the tower doors locked, chains taut, dust undisturbed, the stone steps clean of footprints. Not a mark betrayed the passage of the missing. They wrote it off as mass hysteria. They claimed the villagers had fled in the night, but the journals suggest otherwise. Father Matteo noted in his diary the faces of those who had vanished, descriptions of open eyes, lips moving silently, the same trance-like walk toward the tower. Each witness insisted the bodies were moving of their own accord, yet their hands and feet remained uninjured. They had entered the gates that should have been barred, and the bell had rung. 3 strikes. Later, families would be listed as missing in official records. Some names were never spoken aloud again. Letters requesting information were returned, unopened. Priests swore to higher authorities that the villagers had abandoned their homes voluntarily, but the witnesses knew better. They swore they had seen their neighbors enter the tower, swallowed whole by stone and shadow. They swore they had heard the faintest whispers rising between each toll of the bell, voices calling in a language that made no sense, voices that repeated a rhythm no human could follow. And the bell tolled again, faintly, hours later. No rope moved, no hands pulled, yet the sound carried a weight, a pull. Salvatore could not sleep for weeks. He claimed he heard footsteps in his hallway, whispers in his chambers, a rhythm that mirrored the bell, growing stronger with each toll, and the missing were never found. The family's homes remained empty, doors swung in the wind, animals roamed unattended. The villagers who stayed dared not speak. They avoided the square, avoided the tower, avoided the sound, because it was not the bell they feared. It was the procession, and the understanding that it could claim them, too. The archives show this was not a single night. Later records speak of repeated occurrences. Midnight processions, whole streets moving in silence, witnesses shaking in terror, doors locked from the inside, families gone, and always the bell rang 3 times, and always the gates remained locked. Those who survived never fully recovered. They spoke only in whispers. They never walked near the tower at night. Some refused to leave their homes after dark. The rhythm of the bell haunted their dreams. The echo of the unseen choir followed them, persistent, unyielding. And in the belfry, the bell waited, waiting for the next midnight procession, waiting for the next listener to follow. The village learned silence, obedience, fear, and no one dared to speak of what they saw. Not a word, because speaking might awaken it. The afternoon sun sank low over the valley, casting the village in long, uneven shadows. The bell tower of St. Augustine's rose above the rooftops, dark and imposing, its stones glinting coldly in the dying light. The streets were quiet, the air still, yet the villagers could feel it, a weight pressing down from above. It was 1751. The diocese had intervened. Letters arrived by courier, stamped with the bishop's seal, ordering the tower sealed. Ropes, chains, and locks were reinforced. Priests were forbidden to speak of the bell, forbidden to discuss the disappearances, forbidden to recount the events of decades past. Orders were clear, but silence cannot hold forever. Eyewitnesses, common villagers who had remained after the disappearances, recorded what they could, in secret, in the dead of night. They wrote of muffled tolls, faint yet undeniable. The sound seeped into houses, vibrating through floors, rattling windows that should have remained still. The bell rang. No hand touched the rope. No clapper moved visibly. And that was when they heard it, a rhythm beneath the toll, a low, persistent vibration, almost imperceptible, that carried in the air between each strike. Some said it was like breathing. Others swore they heard faint voices rising in cadence, a choir no one could see, singing in a language long forgotten. Father Lorenzo, assigned to enforce the bishop's orders, recorded in his journal a troubling observation. He had inspected the tower personally. Doors bolted, chains heavy, dust thick on the steps, yet the bell had moved. He wrote, "I saw nothing, Yet the sound came. It came without cause. And it moved me more than any hand ever could. Villagers began to fear the priests almost as much as they feared the bell. Those who spoke of the tolling were admonished. Letters warning against superstition circulated quickly, threatening fines and excommunication. And yet the sounds continued. One widow, Isabella, kept a diary hidden beneath her mattress. She noted the exact time of each toll, its rhythm, the feeling it left in her chest. Her neighbors had abandoned their homes decades before, yet she remained, drawn by some necessity she could not name. 3 strikes, a pause, a whispering hum that vibrated through the stones, and then 3 more strikes. Each night the pattern repeated. She began to dream of the tower, of shadows climbing the stairs, of voices singing beneath the bronze. She wrote a feeling pulled toward in sleep, her body walking where her mind dared not follow. The priests insisted the sound was imagination. They cited wind, settling stone, rodents in the beams. But no one believed them. Children pressed their hands over their ears when the bell tolled. Long before midnight, dogs whimpered at the base of the tower. Doors banged open and shut on nights when the wind was absent. The villagers who survived swore to each other that the bell did not need hands, that it called, that it claimed. Father Lorenzo himself began to falter. He reported hearing the choir, not the tolling alone, but a layered murmur beneath it, names whispered in sequence. The rhythm familiar, almost mathematical. He wrote that he could not stop listening, could not close his ears, could not sleep. He ordered the tower to be sealed tighter. He inspected the locks repeatedly, and each time the sound continued, muffled, unrelenting, insistent. The bishop's letters became sterner. Priests were instructed to preach only of obedience, of faith, of the impossibility of superstition. And still it rang. No human hand, no explanation. And that was when fear turned to terror. Villagers reported seeing shadows at the tower's windows, hands reaching from darkened apertures, brushing the frame, as though pressing against the glass from inside. Some claimed to see figures moving in the tower, though the doors were locked, the chains secure. Those who dare investigate returned shaken, faces pale, eyes vacant, words caught in their throats. The bell's toll followed them home, rising faintly in the walls, vibrating in floors and windows. Father Lorenzo wrote of standing beneath the belfry one evening, lantern in hand, listening to the faint tolling that no one else could hear. The light of his candle danced on the stones. Shadows stretched long. The wind moved strangely through the square, as if carrying a message he could not interpret. And he swore he saw movement, not in the bell itself, not in the belfry, but in the space around it. Figures, unmoving yet present, a choir unseen, following the rhythm of the tolls, singing in a cadence that made the hair on his neck rise. The priests reported the tower sealed. The records insisted silence. The diocese demanded obedience. But the villagers knew better. They kept their own diaries. They noted each strike, each echo, each subtle vibration that reminded them of the missing. The bell had not been silenced. It could not be silenced. And in the valley, shadows gathered around the tower each night. The bell waited, silent yet calling. The choir rose in whispers beneath the bronze, a rhythm none dared follow too closely. Father Lorenzo's final entry was brief. We may forbid the telling, but it will not obey us. It listens. It waits. The village held its breath. The diocese declared faith. The bell continued its work, and the shadow of the tower stretched across every home. The morning fog hung low over the village, clinging to rooftops and curling around the base of St. Augustine's bell tower. Broken shutters rattled on abandoned homes. The streets were silent, empty, yet the air felt heavy, as if pressing down on those who dared approach. It was 1793. The war had reached these hills. Soldiers occupied the village, moving cautiously through narrow lanes. They had orders: destroy the bell, and its sound, end its hold over the valley. The men approached in formation, muskets slung, torches lit. The belfry loomed above, its stones blackened with age and soot. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the square, cast long and angular by the early morning light. The sergeant gave a command, and they began. Men climbed the worn stone steps, their boots scraping against centuries of mortar. The bell hung above, immense, bronze, impossibly heavy. Ropes swayed slightly, though the wind was still. But something wasn't right. Soldiers reported a sensation, a pressure at the back of the skull, a pull at the chest. They halted. Some fell to their knees, gasping, clutching at their heads. Their companions urged them onward, shouting orders, striking with the butts of rifles. And that's when he heard it, a sound beneath the bell. Not its toll, but a hum, low and rhythmic, vibrating in the stone and air alike. Soldiers described it as a voice, layered, moving between them, curling around their limbs, tugging at their hearts. A corporal reached for the rope. He screamed and collapsed. Others tried to continue, gripping tools meant to shatter the bronze. Hammers, chisels, wedges. Each man faltered. Some retched, some fell, silent, eyes wide and unseeing, staring past bell into darkness that should not exist. The sergeant watched his men, shouting commands, beating the air with his fists. The sound intensified. The bell swayed slightly, though untouched. Shadows stretched from the tower, not cast by light, but from some unseen presence. They draped over men like cloth, cold and weightless. One soldier turned and ran. He stumbled across the square, tripping over cobblestones, but when he glanced back, the others were gone. Shadows had taken them, pressing them toward the tower. Their cries were muffled. The sergeant ordered retreat. But even as they descended the steps, the shadows moved with them. They said nothing, spoke nothing. Yet their presence was felt, a suffocating pressure that slowed each step, weakened each muscle. They reached the square. The bell had not moved. Its rope hung still. The bronze gleamed under the weak sun. And yet the sound remained. A faint toll, barely audible. A rhythm beneath the metal. A chorus rising within it. The soldiers covered their ears, staggering back. One man collapsed, foam at his lips. Another screamed, clutching his head. The sergeant drew his sword and struck at the bronze. The sound exploded. Not a clang, not a strike, but vibration that passed through bone, through air, through consciousness itself. He fell back, eyes wide, blood rushing to his ears. Shadows stretched from the bell, falling across his chest, across the square, across the men who had survived long enough to see it. When the smoke from their torches cleared, the square was empty. No soldiers remained. No body, no weapon, only the bell suspended in stillness, the rope untouched, the tower silent to all who dared approach. The villagers whispered later that evening. They had seen them moving in the square, men and boys, shadows draped over their bodies. They had not touched the bell, but the bell had touched them. Reports were filed, papers sent to higher command, letters returned and signed. The soldiers were listed as missing, presumed casualties of war. No explanation could account for what had occurred at St. Augustine's. The bell continued its tolling, faint, persistent, insistent, and the tower stood unchanged, towering over the valley, bronze gleaming, ropes swaying gently in the wind, untouched by human hand. Those who survived the occupation claimed they could still hear it at night, a low vibration, a rhythm beneath the sound, voices rising and falling in cadence, a pull at the mind, a whisper in the chest, and the shadow of the bell reached farther than any soldier could see. It waited for the next hand, for the next ear, for the next soul. The afternoon sun fell weakly across the valley, gilding the edges of St. Augustine's bell tower with a pale, trembling light. Fog drifted low, crawling along the cobbles, clinging to broken shutters and abandoned cottages. The bronze bell loomed above, suspended in its belfry, dark and immovable, yet somehow alive. It was 1924. Modern investigators had arrived. Engineers, historians, technicians with tools and blueprints. They intended to silence the bell once and for all, to dismantle it, to end decades of whispered terror. They approached with confidence. Ladders leaned against stone. Ropes were fastened. Chains secured the bronze as men readied hammers, drills, crowbars. But something wasn't right. The first strike of the hammer met bronze, and the handle splintered. The drill spun, then jammed, teeth fractured against metal that should have yielded. Sparks scattered across stone, and that's when they heard it. The bell tolled. No rope moved. No hand touched the clapper. The sound vibrated in the air, in the walls, in the very bones of those who stood beneath it. Investigators tried again. Ropes frayed, then tied themselves anew. Tools that should have been sturdy bent in impossible angles. The soundproofing they installed failed, collapsing into splinters and shards. Men shouted. They argued. They retreated. But the bell continued, unrelenting, precise, cruel. One engineer, a young man named Paul, climbed to inspect the rope. He held a crowbar, intent on severing it. He froze. The rope twisted slightly, not with wind, not with his hand. It seemed aware, and that's when he heard it, a low hum beneath the tolling, layered, complex, almost deliberate, a rhythm embedded in the bell's vibrations. Paul swore he could hear voices, faint but insistent, following a sequence that made no sense. A pattern, a language beyond comprehension. He stepped back. The crowbar slipped from his grasp, clattering against stone. Sparks flew. The rope hung taut, unbroken. Attempts multiplied. Hammers, wedges, drills, chains, acid, attempt to shatter, to silence, to remove. All failed. A wedge struck bronze and shattered. A bolt drilled into metal and snapped. The bell tolled. Always, investigators recorded the events meticulously. Notes described nausea, vertigo, a subtle weight pressing into the chest. Some swore the bell was watching them, that it knew their intent, that it anticipated each strike. And shadows moved, across the belfry, across the walls, across the faces of the men. Shadows that flickered against torchlight, stretching unnaturally, long and fluid. One technician screamed and fell back. His voice echoed against stone, but no one came to help. The others were too occupied, too horrified to react. The bell tolled. 3 strikes. A pause. A hum rising beneath it. Persistent. Layered voices repeating a rhythm. A cadence. A call. Men's eyes widened. Hands shook. Instruments fell. And then a cry. Paul collapsed, clutching his ears. Others followed. Some ran, some froze. Some simply stared at the bronze, unable to comprehend its resistance. No one dared approach again. Reports sent to universities, to the dioceses, to governmental authorities. All insisted the bell could not be touched. Attempts to explain failure were dismissed as mechanical error, human misjudgment, superstition. But the witnesses knew better. The bell had refused them. It had resisted. It had survived their technology, their steel, their knowledge, and it continued to toll. Faintly at first, then louder, insistent, measured, the rhythm beneath the sound pulsing in the air, wrapping around their minds. A sequence no one could ignore, a call that none could refuse. Engineers left the village, shaken. Reports disappeared or were altered. Letters returned and signed. Records scrubbed, but the bell remained. And at night, those who stayed near the square swore they could hear it through walls, through floors, through the very air, faint but precise. Calling, waiting, claiming. No human hand could stop it. No human mind could resist its rhythm. And beneath the tolling, the whispers of the unseen choir continued, rising, falling, repeating, until the valley itself seemed to breathe in time with the bell. The investigators returned home, forever changed. Some would not speak of what they saw. Some would not leave their rooms after dark. All carried the rhythm in their minds, like a pulse, a memory, a warning. And in the belfry, the bell waited. The valley lay under a frozen sky, the moon casting pale silver over the abandoned village. Roofs sagged under decades of neglect. Windows gaped open like empty eyes, and the stone of St. Augustine's church towered over all, blackened and weathered, yet impossibly intact. Fog crept along the cobblestones, curling around the remnants of cottages, swallowing the alleys in a soft, suffocating haze. The air smelled of damp earth and decay. Silence had claimed the village, but not entirely. It was the feast of St. Augustine. Midnight approached. The locals whispered of it for weeks. careful to avoid drawing attention. Those who dared to speak called it the last toll. One night a year, they said, the bell would sound. Even now, centuries later, it was said to ring once more, summoning its victims. The church had been abandoned for decades. The doors rotted on their hinges. The iron gates were twisted and rusted. Yet inside, the tower remained intact, and the bell waited, suspended in its belfry, bronze gleaming faintly under the moonlight. It seemed to hum with a life of its own. Villagers gathered at the outskirts, shivering, lanterns casting trembling circles of light. They spoke in hushed tones, faces drawn, eyes wide with the fear of what they might see. Each year, they said, the bell rang and claimed someone, sometimes a child, sometimes a man who had lingered too long in the square, sometimes a woman who could not resist approaching the tower's shadow. And that was when they heard it. A faint vibration, low at first, like the thrum of distant thunder. The wind carried it across the valley, and yet it was no wind. The stones seemed to vibrate beneath their feet. The air itself seemed to pulse with the sound, moving through their chests into their bones, leaving an impression they could not shake. The bell tolled once. The sound was deep, resonant, impossible to locate. No rope moved. No hand had struck the bronze. Yet the valley shivered with the resonance, and with the toll came the shadows. Figures moved at the edges of vision, slender, dark, pressing along walls and under arches, not entirely solid, not entirely absent. They were remnants of those who had vanished over centuries, eyes gleaming faintly in the lantern light, silent footsteps that followed the rhythm of the toll. A young woman, Anna, trembled at the edge of the square. She had grown up on the stories. She had seen the journals kept by the elders, records of every disappearance, every toll. But seeing the bell in the moonlight, suspended high above, the bronze glinting with an impossible sheen, filled her with a dread she could not name. She felt compelled to move closer, but something wasn't right. The air pressing on her. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears, loud and insistent. The shadows seemed to reach for her, stretching in impossible ways, defying the angles of the stone. She stopped, lantern shaking, and heard the faintest whisper, as if the bell were speaking directly to her. And that's when she heard it, a murmur beneath the tolling, layered voices, rising and falling, impossible in cadence and number. Names, perhaps, numbers, a rhythm older than the stone, a call that made her knees buckle. The villagers watched her, powerless. No one dared intervene. They had learned long ago that to resist the toll was useless. The bell claimed what it chose. 1, 2, 3 strides. She stepped forward. The bell tolled again. The shadow swept her away, not with force, but with a pull, as though the rhythm itself drew her. Her lantern clattered to ground, throwing sparks of light against the stones, illuminating nothing but emptiness. Silence returned immediately, but the vibration lingered. The villagers whispered afterward. They would not go near the tower until dawn. They counted heads, only to find one fewer. Names left blank in the old ledgers, passed down in silence. Over the next hour, the valley remained still. The bell's tolls no longer sounded, but the rhythm remained in the minds of all who had witnessed it. Heartbeats in sync with something unseen, a memory of terror that did not fade. Some said the shadow of the bell lingered through the village. Doors creaked open by themselves. Windows rattled in the windless night. Dogs whimpered, hiding under broken tables. Even in the morning, when the fog lifted and sunlight reached the square, the absence was palpable. One person was gone, and the echo of the bell haunted everyone else. And each year, the cycle repeated. The feast of St. Augustine approached, and with it, the toll, inevitable and precise. Records of disappearances, whispered accounts, journals, letters, all hinted at the same truth. The bell claimed its own. The church remained abandoned, yet alive, a monument to centuries of dread. And beneath its bronze surface, the rhythm pulsed, waiting for ears to hear, for hearts to follow, for someone to step too close and vanish into the shadows once more. Those who survived the last toll never spoke openly. Some left the village entirely. Some stayed, but avoided the square, avoided the tower, avoided the sound. And yet, at midnight on the feast of St. Augustine, every one of them listened. Even in locked rooms behind shuttered windows, they could hear the faint toll. The bell was patient, eternal, unyielding, and it was hungry. And the village, frozen in time, waited for it to strike again. Perhaps the bell was never meant to call the living, but to summon the dead. Perhaps it tolls not in bronze, but in memory, waiting for those who will listen.